本集节目由永丰金控冠名赞助，翻转金融，共创美好生活，以新闻开启国际视野。永丰金控与您一同掌握全球脉动。从1945年二次大战结束之后，美国跟苏联就开始了长达这个60几年的冷战。那冷战结束之后，现在我们似乎又看到了一个美国跟中国大陆的新冷战。针对这个问题，英国皇家国际事务研究所的所长罗宾·尼布莱特曾经写过一本书，就是 The New Cold War，How the contest between China and US will shape our century， 就是深入剖析了美中之间的竞争怎么样子重塑这个全球的新冷战。尼布莱特在5月12号下午1点钟的时候，会在这个亚监会举行的第3届国际论坛当中来做主题演讲。我们在他来台北之前特别访问了他，跟他来谈他眼中看到的在川普新关税政策之后的美中新冷战。Thank you, Mr. Niblett, for taking the time, and hope to see you in Taipei on Monday. But I would like to begin with the book you wrote, and our reader here is very interested to know your concept about the new Cold War and how different is it from the old Cold War as we know it. And in particular, do you think that China and the United States are already in a stage of new Cold War?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I mean, look, to my reading, I think the United States and China are already in a new Cold War. Mm-hmm. For the simple reason that, these are by far the two most powerful nations in the world. That doesn't automatically mean you be in a Cold War, but they're two countries that are contesting each other geopolitically, and I would say, in my opinion, ideologically. What do I mean by this? Geopolitically, each sees the other's core strength, military, economic, and technological, as a challenge to their own power and influence. Certainly the United States is used to being the most powerful military country in the world since 1945 and has built a string of bases around the world that allow it to project its influence, protect its allies, and retain its security, not just across the Atlantic, but also across the Pacific. And if you look at the economic front, the United States has held steady at about 20-25% of world GDP since 1945, but it has now seen China rise from the small single digits to be its true challenger at a bit under 20, let's call it 18-19% of world GDP. I think of the technology space in particular. Again, the United States is used to commanding the top heights of advanced technology. But if you look at many of the recent surveys, including one by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on critical technologies, maybe a more radical assessment, but nonetheless one that is highly respected. They have China leading the United States in 54 of 67 world technologies. And this is a complete turnaround from before. So what you have is a deep contest taking place between the two. And if you're sitting in China, obviously reliant upon global trade for access to your exports, to get your exports out, but also to import all of those critical commodities and minerals and so on around the world that they use to be able to power their economy. What you've got is a string of what's called the first island chain, as you well know, because in the middle of it is Taiwan, and to one side you've got South Korea and Japan, and to the south you've got Philippines. So there's a real sense in China and Beijing, I believe, to want to sort of break out from this military geopolitical constraint to be able to be, if it wants to be, potentially one of the most powerful nations in the world from a technology, military, and economic standpoint, and not be constrained. But if this is where the ideological dimension comes in as well. I worked in Washington for 15 years of my career. And one thing you're aware of in the United States is a deep concern that their main competitor might be an ideological competitor in the sense that a party run by one party, a country, run by one party, the Communist Party State of China. So having the Communist Party of China be the leading, leader of China in that sense is one that creates great insecurity and concern in the US Congress. And you can see the various congressional committees that have been set up to try to do this. There's a fear that a country run by one party state is going to be more threatening to US interests around the world and to democracy around the world. And therefore, they're worried that this rise in material power, geopolitical, military, economic, is combined with a one-party system, that somehow this one-party system will be more aggressive internationally than they are. Now, obviously, if you're sitting in Beijing, the view is the complete opposite. The view is that the United States is a much more aggressive power, that it tries to promote democracy around the world, and that it wants to undermine the Communist Party of China, both in China, but also they're worried about increasing Chinese influence in Africa, in ASEAN, around the world. And they see a lot of their technologies as being ones that promote Chinese ideological interests. The TikTok ban, the ban on TikTok that the US Congress wanted to implement, was one because they felt that Chinese technology might undermine American democracy. So, each side, I think, sees each other as their number one competitor, not just from a military, technological, economic standpoint, but also two different systems of government that can't coexist. So when I look at everything that's happening, the technology bans the US has imposed, some of the trade bans, which are not just about trade disputes over illegal support for subsidies in China, but also are about trying to kind of constrain China's economic power. These are all demonstrations of this new Cold War that we're already in.
But let me ask you, I'm persuaded by the ideological or the military confrontation. But as for economic, there's a lot of saying about how China is so different from the old Soviet style. It's more economic interdependence with the United States than before. So do you think this kind of interdependence will be breaking apart, like decoupling, due to the recent tariff war between the US and China? Or do you think that this kind of interdependency has been so strong, it's very hard to break and into a Cold War model?
Look, I think this is a key question. The reality is, certainly I would argue that in Beijing, there has been a long-term awareness that interdependence with the US economy was going to become a risk to the future security of China and to the security of this Communist Party as the leader of China. Right back from the Made in China 2025 program that was released in 2015, through the dual circulation model, the idea that China would look to be able to increase reliance on its own market for top technologies, which was introduced in 2019. China's been looking to reduce its dependence on America for high technology inputs into its future economic growth. Because I think the fear in Beijing, correctly, as it turns out, was that at some point the US government would realize it was aiding the rise of its competitor and would look to try to hold it back. They were correct in that assessment, but of course this has happened maybe a little more quickly than they expected, in particular with Donald Trump. The Chinese government has also been reducing its dependence on recycling its trade surpluses through US government debt, US Treasury bills, having sort of capped its total holding of US Treasury bills at around $900 billion about 5 or 6 years ago, it has been steadily but slowly declining to about $750 billion now, even though the Chinese economy and its trade surpluses have continued growing. So I would argue that China has been on a determined path for the last 10 years at least to start to reduce its dependence on the US economy. Now, trade, certainly I think they hoped that trade in non-sensitive areas, toys and furniture and clothing and all of those sorts of things would continue unaffected. But what we found in the US is also a realization that its interdependence with the Chinese economy is one that is deeply concerning. Number one, obviously, having a company like Apple, import 90% of its US targeted iPhones and iPads, for example, from manufacturing in China. When you tell this to people in Washington today, they're going, what? How did we let that happen? How did we let our main competitor geopolitically become such an important part of our trading network? Reliance on China for rare earth minerals, which are essential not just for US iPhones and US electronics, but also for US fighter jets. I mean, when you tell this to US people today, they go, how did we let that happen? So I think we're at the beginning of an effort by both sides to reduce their dependence on the other. We now get into other viewpoints. In my opinion, the Trump administration doesn't want to destroy all trade with China, but certainly the Trump administration wants to reduce its dependence for critical technologies on China. And obviously they want to reduce the trade deficit with China. But I think right now, if you're in China, would you want to increase your dependence on US liquefied natural gas imports? I don't think so, because obviously you're seeing in the United States a much more a threatening partner. So yes, look, China has reduced its reliance on the United States for its exports from roughly 25% of its exports about 10 years ago. It's down to roughly 15% today. As a share of Chinese GDP, trade as a whole has been declining as well. So I think both countries they're a beginning of a journey to make themselves less dependent on each other. Completely, cut off from each other? No, I don't think either side wants that. But we are still at the beginning of a journey of a reduction of trade and technology interdependence. I'm certain of that.
So it seems to me that you are more pessimistic rather than optimistic one in terms of how this trade war will end. And are you suggesting that we are seeing a watershed movement at this time between the US and China in terms of economic relations?
I think it's a watershed moment for, two reasons. One, it's a watershed moment that has been coming. As I think I indicated, I think both the Chinese government and the US government have both been looking for ways. I describe it in my book as they're reversing into a new Cold War. They came together, they've interconnected in all sorts of ways, and then they realized, if you're in Beijing, oh my God, we rely on US for key technologies. And in America, they go, oh my God, we rely on China for all critical imports. And they're like reversing away from each other, trying to see how far they can go without really undermining each other's economies and the welfare of their people. I think the Biden administration wanted to do this in a gradual way, try to find a new happy medium, if I can describe it, of less dependence but continued trade. This was the famous small yard with a high fence, this idea that the US would target certain technologies and create a high fence, but then the rest would be fine. Now, even there, there was some spillover from quantum computing, semiconductors, AI, which was the original small yard with the high fence. Even under Biden, there was debate over electric vehicle imports from China. There was some debate where they imposed high tariffs. There was some debate over cloud computing. But in general, I think the Biden administration was looking to try to find a sort of balanced relationship. The problem with Trump is that his view is much more, I'd say, extreme about trade. And he's really looking to try to create America as a balanced trading partner with all countries in the world. And that's not a realistic outcome, given that Americans spend much more than they invest. If you spend more than you invest, you will have a trade deficit with someone. So, I think with Trump, we've moved into an unpredictable phase of the Cold War, which is more risky.
Let me push from another direction. Some would even suggest that this kind of economic tension would somehow eventually lead to military confrontation. For instance, the rare earth is something that every power would like to have. Some even suggest that, such as prior to World War II, Japan is responding to the U.S. oil embargo and is reacting by attacking the Pearl Harbor. Are you foreseeing that something like that might happen?
Look, I think, in my opinion, good knowledge of the United States, my knowledge of China, such as it is, is that I think both sides absolutely want to avoid military conflict. The key there are similarities, obviously, with the 1930s, and not just the rise of global trade protectionism that we saw before World War II, but as you rightly noted, there would be a danger, and I actually mentioned this in my book, that the perception in Beijing, as it was in Tokyo, might be that the country was being completely constrained. But there were two different dimensions to this. Number one, Japan was looking for an empire in the 1930s. Taiwan knows well about this. Japan was looking for an empire in its neighborhood. It wanted dominant kind of military and geoeconomic power over that region and wanted to have it just for itself. Japan obviously was far smaller as an economy compared to the then burgeoning the United States in the late 1930s. And the threat of the oil embargo on Japan really was absolutely systemic to its survival as a country. China is America's peer. Certainly at economic levels, increasingly at military, and probably already at a technological level. It has a 1.4 billion person single market that in some ways, although it is dependent on trade for the rest of the world for its level of wealth and the way it's achieved it, if it needed to survive as a single economy, it is now getting to the point where, along with its good relationship with other markets in Africa, across ASEAN, which is now ASEAN being China's largest trading partner, being the second largest trading partner, America now third on the list. I think that China is far better positioned to survive the beginnings of this new Cold War, maybe even thrive in it. Whereas Japan, it was existential. So I think from the parallel of the 1930s, if I judge on this, I hope I'm right, don't apply in this case. Some of the concerns that I would have, obviously, about military conflict are more accidental around South China Sea, where there is contestation as to whether these are international waterways or, as Beijing states, sovereign maritime territory for China. Obviously, there are, all sorts of tensions around Taiwan, where the United States again sees international waterways, and China has a view on Taiwan that ultimately it needs to become fully part of mainland China and not be a separate entity. These types of issues could lead to an accidental element. I don't see the parallel of the 1930s being dominant. I'll simply say that we have to be cautious. I don't want to say 100% anything, but that would be my judgment.
This year will be the 80th anniversary after the World War II. There's different kind of international institution to design to prevent another major war happening. WTO, IMF, or even the United Nations. But do you think those institutions have been capable of preventing us from having another major conflict? What I have in mind is, for instance, would they be able to incorporate, for instance, the rise of China in terms of its economic power, in terms of IMF the voting right, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
Are those institutions irrelevant now, or is it going to cease to exist anymore?
That's a very interesting and difficult question, because I think they're all slightly different in a way.
Right.
Yes, you're correct. Each of those institutions is part of the architecture that was designed by the victors of World War II to try to prevent the return of war in the future. The UN as an entity, I think, is going to survive because it's the only body that includes all countries of the world. And in a way, it sort of defines the existence of states as actors in international affairs. The UN Security Council was designed to try to prevent war, except war between major powers or war involving major powers. Because as you know, in the UN Security Council, the 5 permanent members can veto any rule by anyone else. So it was quite a clever structure to design to try to allow the major powers to stop war happening between other countries. But if they were involved in one of those wars, think Iraq with the United States in 2003, they were able to veto the efforts by the UN Security Council to stop it from happening. You know, the UN Security Council didn't stop the Vietnam War from happening in the last Cold War. So, you know, when great powers do what they want to do, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, most recently, the UN system doesn't prevent them. Unfortunately, that's a theoretical statement. I don't think the UN Security Council is going to be reformed anytime soon because the big powers like the privileges they have and aren't going to let anyone else in. So I think the UN is an imperfect system as the main UN body, but it'll survive. The WTO, I think probably will survive even without the United States, simply because people will hope. Most countries appreciate some rules-based system that allows them to go to a sort of court and resolve disputes while allowing trade to continue and to grow. The United States, I was always surprised that the US Congress, which, as you know, tends to reject any treaties that restrain the US Congress's right to power. The US is not part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, for example. You know, the United States has been restrictive on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. You know, the US is not a member of the International Criminal Court. You know, the US generally doesn't like to see its great power status challenged or its freedom of action challenged in any way. And I was always amazed that they allowed the WTO court to overrule American trade policy. You know, we're probably moving to an element of reality. So I think the WTO will survive, but I can't imagine, you know, future US presidents being full members of it. So we're then going to end up with much more trade fragmentation, but that's been happening in any case. And it's not always a negative thing. The European Union exists alongside the WTO. ASEAN exists alongside the WTO. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that China is involved in with ASEAN and Australia, South Korea, and Japan is in parallel to the WTO. So again, I don't see that as a critical element. The IMF, but just to show how complicated this system is, the IMF, I think it looks to me, is going to be incapable of accommodating China. China still only has a 6% voting weight, even though its GDP weight, as I said, is around 18-19% of world GDP. Problem, of course, is China so far does not want to allow its currency to be globally tradable. It is not yet an international currency, and part of the responsibility of IMF members is to allow your currency in a way to be used as a global currency. So yes, maybe it's unfair for China, but at some levels, I think China's kind of happy that it doesn't have a higher voting weight in the IMF. It would carry responsibilities that Beijing still doesn't want to carry. But what we see happening, and I'll finish on this point, is the world sort of adjusting international systems to ones that suit different countries. So China has launched the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So, even though its voting share is small in the World Bank, its voting share is quite high in the AIIB. And AIIB actually has got lots of countries involved, including Britain and most G7 members, except for Japan and the United States. And then you've got, apart from AIIB, you've got the New Development Bank, this sort of BRICS Bank, as it was called, which is looking for ways to do trading using non-dollar currencies. So you reduce the dominance of the dollar in global trade and global finance. So the way I think of it, and I described in my book, is we have the old multilateral system is sort of less influential. But we have workarounds. People are finding ways to do international cooperation around the institutions of the Second World War. So I'm not too worried about this.
But there is a collective security system that we in Asia have been very envy. It's the NATO.
Yes.
NATO had been quite effective until recently after Russia had invaded Ukraine. And we are seeing that with Donald Trump getting in office, the European countries are having a very serious doubt about the function or even the very existence of the NATO if ever the U.S. is considering withdrawal from NATO. How do you see the function of NATO? And now the European countries try to develop a parallel organizations like the French is providing a nuclear umbrella or the Germany is expanding its military expenditure. Would that be sufficient to replace NATO in a way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're right in the middle of this, obviously. Look, in my opinion, the expansion of NATO, even before the arrival of Donald Trump, was stretching the credibility of NATO's Article 5. Now, NATO's Article 5 is the article that says that one member will always come to the assistance of another member if there is conflict and war involving them. But we must remember, very importantly, if you read the language of NATO's Article 5, it does not require any member to come to military assistance of the other member.
Okay. I assume that was considered military, right?
That was deliberate by the United States. The United States did not want to find itself dragged into wars unnecessarily. But when the Cold War then became more and more intense between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the US started deploying troops, large numbers of troops to Europe to help protect Western Europe from a Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, then that commitment started to be interpreted, and Americans have nuclear weapons deployed on European territory. That commitment started to be interpreted as a military one. The US, from 350,000 troops, now only has about 80,000 troops deployed in Europe, and Trump might withdraw even a few of those in the future. Plus, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. A lot of Eastern Europe has been absorbed into NATO, as well as into the European Union. So we have a much changed, I'd say, international context, and one in which Americans don't feel threatened by the Soviet Union. There is no Soviet Union. Most Americans don't feel threatened by Russia, for that matter. Russia's a long way away. Most Americans feel more threatened by China than they do by Russia. Some people might say that's illogical, but that is the view in Washington today. Of that, there is no doubt. And so, can you, as a European, trust an American president? If Russia were to invade Estonia, for example, a small Baltic state that used to be a member of the Soviet Union, can we be confident that a US president would go as far as threatening nuclear war with Russia to try to protect that small little Baltic state? I think even before Donald Trump, many European leaders were liking not to think about that question. But since the invasion of Ukraine, and then which is not a NATO member, admittedly, but is bordering NATO members and has relationships with NATO, and with the arrival of Donald Trump, who's kind of saying, well, hey, spheres of influence, what's wrong with that? I want to dominate Greenland and Panama. Why shouldn't Russia sort of dominate its own neighborhood? Would be the logical conclusion of that particular thought. Why, at that point, Europeans, I think, are deeply concerned. Now, to answer the second half of your question, so there is some doubt about the credibility of NATO, but I think what Europeans have concluded is we must become more responsible members of NATO. If we cannot have a situation where America spends more than all of European countries combined, nearly twice as much as European countries combined on their defense. We need to be more responsible for our security in Europe, because if we are, then America might be a better ally to us in the future. America is not like free riders, yes, the term they use. They want, this in Taiwan, they want to know that their allies are looking after their own security, then they might come and help them, if you see what I'm saying. Undoubtedly, Europeans, they've already announced, are going to spend a lot more on defense. Britain is going up to 2.7%. Poland of GDP on defense. Poland has doubled its defense spending. It's nearly 5% of GDP on defense. Germany is already at 2%, and that is a lot of money for a big economy like Germany. Hardly absorb it. The EU is not a natural counterparty to NATO. It's not structured as a defense organization. It doesn't have its own integrated military command. And ultimately, most Europeans don't want to lose the potential connectivity with America that comes through NATO. So what you're finding Europe doing now is trying to find a way to make themselves more powerful as military countries, but then to try to say, we'd like to be better partners in NATO. And if America doesn't want to be involved in a particular conflict in our neighborhood, we want to at least be able to use NATO structures, NATO infrastructure, NATO satellite systems, NATO air-to-air refueling, NATO airborne ground surveillance, NATO command and control infrastructure. It's a system called Berlin Plus, NATO Plus, which was a system devised about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, to try to make the Europeans be able to do more things on their own without America, but using NATO's infrastructure. So we're trying to play this clever line, despite Trump, that maybe after Trump, a future American president will still be committed to NATO, but we as Europeans will then look like better allies. And this comes to my last point on the nuclear element. It is, I think, in my opinion, not credible that either Britain or France could extend their nuclear deterrent credibly over France or Poland or the Baltic states in the absence of the US backing them up. If I were the German chancellor or the Polish president or prime minister, how could I trust France, the French president, would sacrifice France for Poland if there was a war with Russia? I just don't believe it. There is no structure out there. There is no system of government. The EU still does foreign policy decision-making by consensus. There is no qualified majority voting, even on imposing sanctions. That is such a long stretch to go and believe, that one country to another. So what becomes most important here is that the Ukraine war has demonstrated that strong conventional nuclear capability can be a deterrent to nuclear threat. Ukraine has demonstrated this. President Putin basically threatened nuclear war on anyone that supported Ukraine. We've supported Ukraine. Ukraine is still resisting, and there's been no nuclear war. Now, again, this is very dangerous territory I'm talking on, and something terrible could happen tomorrow, and Vladimir Putin might decide I've had enough, and I want to do some demonstration effect. But that would carry enormous risks for Russia, globally in its relations with China, and nuclear weapons are not very effective as a way of sort of taking territory. So I just think that what many Europeans have concluded, we need to invest more in our conventional capability, become better allies, and hope that America will stay with us. And if not, it's will be stronger conventionally, and that might be enough.
So if you are saying that the prime threat that is posing to the United States nowadays is China, then how is American is going to do with its Asian allies? I mean, so far, I admit that you just said that the American don't like the free riders. And Donald Trump also mentioned in one of his interviews saying that Taiwan, China, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, those countries prosper at American expense. So, so far we are seeing American security alliance in Asia is all bilateral. There's no multilateral alliance being going on. So how is the U.S. is going to deal with China in terms of security in the future in Asia?
Yeah. Look, this is obviously for you and for Asia Pacific region a critical question. What's the U.S. going to do? The first thing I think I have to say, which is most important, we cannot assume that America's approach to foreign policy and security policy in the future will be the same as the Trump administration's policy. This is before I even talk about the Trump administration, which itself is divided, as you know. But what I would simply say is President Trump himself and many of those closest to him in outlook do reflect an important stream, a long-standing stream of American foreign policy, going back to the Neutrality Act of the 1930s and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Acts of the 1930s. You know, this is not new. This has always existed. But America's superpower, if I can describe it that way, and its ability to deal with its global security has always relied on having allies. Because the one thing that America learnt painfully from the First World War and Second World War is that it is better to defend America forward. Don't defend America at your own shores. And that fundamental principle, I believe, is going to remain America's fundamental principle of defense. This is why even Marco Rubio, the current Secretary of State, was one of the movers of legislation back in 2024 that prevents any US president from unilaterally removing America from NATO. Marco Rubio, the guy who's, Secretary of State to Trump. And I think the same thinking applies in Asia. Now, therefore, America's alliances in Asia are hugely important to America in order to be involved in its new Cold War with China, to protect itself against what it perceives as the China threat. The reason they are bilateral alliances, as you will appreciate, is that there is no Europe in Asia. We were able to reabsorb Germany into Europe because Germany was divided, because Germany was weak. And in the end, NATO and the European Union were structures within which Germany was allowed to rebuild. But the Japan-South Korea relationship remains very toxic politically. There is no, the two sides, for historical reasons, have never resolved properly their, Japan's invasions that were taking place of Korea, as it did of Manchuria. There's a lot of history that has not been resolved yet. There is the geographic lack of contiguity. Japan being an island separate from South Korea, Taiwan being an island separate from South Korea, Philippines separate from, these are not physically contiguous. There is no European Union. There is no additional economic structure that links Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, ASEAN, Philippines. So, the Asia Pacific is just by geography and history, separate units. And what America has done is build up its relationship with each of those separate units because that is the reality. Not, I think, out of any strategic goal to keep them separate, but that is the strategic reality, number one. However, beyond that, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, I think it's the same story. Biden was trying to link the countries together, US, Japan, South Korea, trilateral partnership that was signed back in 2023, if I remember rightly now, or was it 24? I think it was 2023. You've had them trying to sort of bring Taiwan into the conversation with some of the security relationship language that they've used there. So the Americans have sought to try to knit a little more together the countries, trust a bit more. Trump, of course, as with Europe, treats everything individually and wants to deal with each country individually. And again, he's saying the same thing. Why aren't you spending more on defense? So I think the natural thing is that America's Asian allies must spend more on their own defense if they want to rely on America as a reliable long-term ally. We don't know what will come after Trump, but the one thing we do know is that Americans in general, voters, are tired of having to spend money for everyone else's defense when they themselves, many Americans, feel that they're much worse off after inflation, the global financial crisis, and the inequality that's happened within the American economy. So even a president after Trump who values America's alliances will expect its allies to spend much more on their own defense, like in Europe, and expect us to be contributors to our own defense with America as a sort of backup, yeah? And the American backup, as we know, it's hugely valuable because it's going to take Europe and Asia a long time to be able to really do our own security in any particular way. Maybe I should stop there. I don't think, the idea of NATO, clearly what Biden was looking to do was to try to knit together somewhat Indo-Pacific and European security allies. And we've had Japan and South Korea and Australia attending NATO summits. We have NATO members doing Indo-Pacific patrolling, naval patrolling, maritime patrolling. The Trump administration is not interested in blending the two theaters at all. A future American president probably is relatively indifferent as well.
My final question before you leave for the airport is that what kind of role do you think that Taiwan will play in this new Cold War between U.S. and China? I mean, if we draw on the parallel with the war in Ukraine, some people are suggesting that U.S. should ask Taiwan not to provoke China by claiming itself a sovereign country, while others are advising White House should never give in to China's demand that Taiwan should be part of China. What do you think on that?
Taiwan is going to be one of the most intractable issues in the new Cold War. I think it's inescapable given Beijing's announcement and statements, that the two sides must be reunified into one sovereign state, by 2049. I think both sides want to avoid escalation in the near term, Trump in particular, but I think the same went for the Biden administration. They have different ways of doing this. We're seeing that I think what China is doing and Beijing is doing is trying to use the uncertainty about America's commitment to its allies that President Trump has raised to try to change the political mood inside Taiwan, to kind of say, look, America's never going to be there for you, so we need to find a way to come to a compromise where you give up aspects of your kind of sovereign ability to act on trade policy or where you run your politics, etc., etc. Your military forces, all of those elements that obviously drive Beijing very angry. And I think that at the moment, if I was sitting in Beijing, I wouldn't be rushing things. I would say, allow doubt about America as a provider of ultimate security to grow, while China's own military capacity continues to grow at the same time. China has already broken the conventions, should we describe them, about not crossing the median line too many times. It has done, exercises that are if not, been virtual blockades for brief days, and then taken them away. And then people talk about doing a quarantine rather than a blockade. It's trying to create a sort of gray zone around Taiwan that is going to make many foreign investors think, gosh, should we really be having our key investments in Taiwan? Can we trust Taiwan as a part of the global economic supply chain economically? And if not, then maybe people don't invest in much in Taiwan. Then the Taiwanese people start to think, oh my goodness, maybe we need to compromise with Beijing, or our economy will go down. When I look at the example of Ukraine, I often say, and maybe this is a slightly arrogant statement to make, but I think the leaders in Beijing, as I understand them, look at what Russia does and then think, we better not do that. Most things what Russia does tend to, be quite self-harmful over time. And right from, closing down the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which obviously Beijing thinks was a bad idea, right through to invading a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think they will look to try to do things the Chinese mainland way and not the Taiwanese, not the Russian way. Now, where does that leave Taiwan? Inevitably in a difficult position. If the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese leadership want to have America as a valued ally in the long term, then they are going to have to spend much more on defense. No doubt about it, as Europeans are doing. Simply to be able to have America by your side in whatever shape or form, whether it's Trump or a future Trump administration, spending more on defense is a critical way of ensuring that valuable connectivity. How Taiwan then survives, if you see what I'm saying, in this ambiguity, I think Taiwan obviously as well is trying to look to the long term, because much like America, it wants the status quo to continue.
Right.
And for me, the big question for the long term is, can one have a status quo that is not today's status quo, but is enough of a status quo to satisfy both the Taiwanese people's desire for the unique forms of freedom that they've created in their region? Taiwan is recognizable to a European as a country with relatively independent press, as we have relatively independent press in Europe, with elections, with a thriving civil society. That experiment, that reality, is something that I imagine most Taiwanese people are going to want to sustain for as long as they possibly can. So the question is, how can you do that at the same time as a rising Cold War between the United States and China? I have to confess, I don't have the answer to it. But the one thing I do know is that America as an ally in the context of this new Cold War is going to be looking for strong allies. And I also am confident that China will be looking at Taiwan and seeing it as a key element in its Cold War with the United States. And the status quo is not something it is going to be satisfied with for the long term. So I don't have an answer for the solution for the long term. For the near term, you obviously protect your civil society, which I know all Taiwanese want to do. And at least you need to be a good ally to the United States to be able to have at least choices in the future for your own future.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, and looking forward to meet you and hear your talk on Monday in Taipei. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, me too. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye.
We're saying goodbye. I'll log off as well. That was great. Thank you very much.
Bye.
All the best, Dr. Guo. I'll see you when I get to Taipei. Bye-bye.
上网搜寻 VIP.udn.com 到联合报数位版，看更多精彩的报道。